Oh, I always forget that. Thank you. Got it. Thank you, whoever did that. Yes, Research Data Alliance. We are in P18 Breakout 12. This is a repeat session from one last week, all about persistence. And I want to just thank Jonathan Clark for um, organizing this. He did the lion's share of the work here. And he is with myself, Jonathan, and Adrian Burton. We are co-chairs of the Persistent Identifier Interest Group. So welcome today to the session. We have an all-star lineup for a plenary, and we're really here to have a discussion about what does persistence mean. So I'm going to just, this is always what happens. I can never get to the next slide. There we go. So we're going to talk a little bit about the PID interest group for newcomers, about who we are, an introduction to this meeting very briefly, and then welcome the expert panel. Sorry, I don't know if Jens has slides or Larry, but Maggie Hellstrom, Natasha Simons, Jens Klump, Phil Jones, and Larry Lanham will share a bit on their perspectives on what does persistence mean. And then we will open up for discussion. You are welcome and encouraged to add comments into the chat. And as somebody is sharing their thoughts on the expert panel, please, if you have a question or a comment, add that into the chat in the session. All right. And oops, sorry. We have just a couple introductory slides here. There's a wonderful 5 persistencies that Andrew Trailer has this wonderful slide talking about how do we talk about persistence of an object and an identifier, and what the different services are that ensure persistence. So binding the identifier to the object, but also resolving the object through the identifier, those two pieces. And so when we talk about persistence, it could be the object, the identifier, the binding between the two, the service that allows for updates, there's a resolution service, and who knows what else. So lots of things when we talk about persistence, lots of ways to think about this. What has come up over and over, not just in this session, but also is when we talk about persistence, we also talk about trust and trustworthy and systems and organizations and people. And so one of the things that, and Jonathan, I believe, put this together, is thinking about what is a trustworthy PID system. If you want to have something persist, you need to have something that's trustworthy, something that's maintained by a dedicated and reliable team based on a transparent business model that is also sustainable, provided by a nonprofit organization, subject to regular quality assessments by external parties, governed by boards of stakeholders, based on open standards, based on a redundant and secure architecture. This is the part that is often missed. Supporting a huge address space, and also supporting an openly documented API with a specific data model. So this is pieces of what we talk about with the trustworthy PID system. I think there's also aspects of this that isn't directly addressed in here. We talked about a dedicated and reliable team, but also thinking about things like what are the principles and values of the organization or organizations that are running these systems is also really critical. What is the governance structure? We talked about governed by international boards, but what does that look like? How is it governed? We've talked about nonprofit aspects as well. So there's a lot in here. There isn't just one way to do this, but I think these are definitely points that should be part of a sustainable and trustworthy PID system. All right, so we do have collaborative notes for this session. As you join, please add your name into those collaborative notes. There is a link to that Google document in the chat window. It's been added several times, so please go there, add your name, your contact information. We are going to collect thoughts, so what it gets put in the chat, we will save off into this document. And if you have comments or questions, you can either share them in the chat or you can share them directly in the document. All right, I think that is it. Okay, so going back to the agenda, the Persistent Identifier Interest Group was established, I'm even trying to remember when it was established, a number of years ago. I think it was like the 5th plenary. And the idea with the Persistent Identifier Interest Group was that there were lots of things going on in the PID space and not a lot of coordination between them. So the idea with the interest group was to say, look, this is a place that people can come and share what is happening in the different spaces where persistent identifiers are being discussed, and hopefully provide that the glue in the community, understanding and ways of sharing information about what's happening, and also a place to raise questions that maybe the interest group could spin off a working group to delve into a little bit more. So the PID is really seen as kind of this space for sharing information. This particular meeting, as I mentioned, is focused all about persistence. And I'm just going to stop talking at this point and turn this over to Maggie. Maggie does not have slides, so I'm just going to unshare my screen so we can see Maggie. And go ahead.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, so I thought I would present a few thoughts about persistence from an earth and environmental science point of view, because I work as a research data management specialist at the data center of ICOS, which is Integrated Carbon Observation System. It's a European organization or research infrastructure that is collecting data on greenhouse gases and the exchanges between the atmosphere and the Earth's surface. And we are not doing research ourselves, but we are making this data available to anyone who wants to use it. And of course, being in something that has to do with climate environment, that means that there's a lot of people who are all the time looking and trying to find fault with what we are doing and trying to look for whether we are manipulating our data and stuff like that. So I think even those who are not in the hot air of the climate debate, but still are working with the environmental data, we are all sort of capturing, when we're making observations, we're capturing snapshots of reality of a given time and space. So we cannot go back and repeat the measurements exactly. So in the beginning, I would say there's always been a discussion about making sure that the data themselves are and also the metadata about the measurements and observations were persistent. But maybe not worrying so much about having pointers so that others could find the data, but storing them somewhere in a safe place. But then, of course, as modern science has moved on, and for instance, the FAIR principles and also open science has become more and more commonly discussed, and people also realize that attaching persistent identifiers would also be a great idea, because not only could you make sure that the linkage with the location of the data objects would be sort of more secure and more persistent, but you could also, for instance, easily store information about fixity or checksums and stuff together with already in the PID record. But then we moved on, of course, and also to enforce machine actionability has become more and more important to be able to utilize the metadata records or the metadata in especially handle-based PID systems this idea of the fair digital object is becoming more and more important also for earth and environmental science. But therein lies a bit of a danger in my point of view. So I want to sort of throw out this perhaps slightly controversial or negative point of view, that the more that we are using linkages and also in the metadata record, not putting the information as such. For instance, this variable is carbon dioxide concentration expressed as micromoles or something like that per square cubic meter. But instead, we link to a definition of a variable somewhere. So that link, if we're using a PID and it's pointing in its turn to a definition in a type registry or something like that. That's all really nice also for machine actionability, but what happens if these links start to rot, if they are broken, so that you can no longer really follow these sort of chains of PIDs going all the way from a value to a standard and an explanation of what this is and all of these things. Should we start worrying about this? Should we start making snapshots of all of these linkages somehow and store together with the data objects, or or is that not necessary? Should we just lean back and relax and trust all these trusted registries and repositories?
So I'm wondering, Maggie, if a question there is what is the metadata that needs to be included in the base file that you're sharing? And I'm not asking you to answer. I'm just wondering, kind of with you, like you said, how much should be relied on the link, but can you have a link and part of that metadata definition in the data file?
In some cases, yes, that would work out. But I think that if you, for instance, have a data file that is common in my field, like a CSV type system, which has maybe 150 columns in it, and each representing variables, and then you would want to point to variable definitions, for instance. Yes, you could put some of that stuff directly in the file so that it's also or in the metadata. But if you really want to be machine actionable and support AI and all of these things, then it would be more convenient to just be able to put the linkages in there, just to smooth the workflows and minimize the coding that has to be done.
It's a provocative question, Maggie.
Yes.
And it's a good one. I'll just point out that your reliance on connections that are even more hidden is of course there. There are lots of things connected to lots of things that aren't actually sitting beneath your keyboard. And one thing about the links that we're describing now is that we're focused on them and they're sort of new, so we're worried about them. And it's right to worry about it. But what your point means to me is we really have to make sure these are robust and solid links. We can't build a fragile linking infrastructure. We have to pay attention to engineering. We have to be sort of anal about this and make sure it really works. But yes. I hope you keep making that point because it's a great one.
Yes, and we also, as someone was pointing out to me when I was talking about pretty much what I was just saying earlier today in another forum, and the semantics guy stood up and said that, yeah, he really saw this as a danger because of this community aspect that is entering into this. We are sort of encouraging communities, research communities of disciplines, etc., to put up, for instance, their own provenance registry or their own variable definitions registries, etc. And I think that's fine as long as they are hosting those registries in trusted places, in data centers which really are trustworthy, and where there is money to sustain the effort for quite some time. And if they don't have money anymore, then someone else can take over this to have redundancy. But this is something that we really need to think about. And especially as we are going into more and more interdisciplinary research. So if someone from health is wanting to use our data on greenhouse gas and pollution and stuff, then they need to be able to follow all of these links to make sense of our data.
All right. Sorry for going in and out on video here. Any other questions or comments right now on Maggie before we move on to the next person on the panel? All right.
Just agree very quickly with Larry that, if our knowledge infrastructure is so dependent on that linkage, which I think is, Maggie has established that is a fact, then you'd have to agree with Larry that it really requires proper engineering, because for all other parts of our life, we wouldn't risk something that we depend on. Importantly, has engineering standards for it, so that when you're driving on the road or using a bridge, because we all depend on it, then there are really I think Larry used the word standards to make sure that it's robust. And you really wouldn't want the whole sort of scholarly, the knowledge infrastructure to just fall in a heap because of soft linkage.
Yeah, part of what I'm wondering is that in addition to the digital links is to have a long-lived code book, right? So if the link breaks, you can still have definitions that are available somehow in a reference manual. But anyway, I'm getting into the weeds. All right, Natasha, you're up next.
All right, thanks, Laurie. So I'm going to zoom out from that. So on Andrew Trelaw's diagram there on the left-hand side, there was service, the overall PID service. And so I'm going to talk from the PID provider perspective in the sense that, you know, we directly provide a PID called RAID through ARDC, but we also provide PID services, you know, like DOIs and handles, etc., to the Australian research sector. So just let me share my screen. I've got some really eclectic set of slides here. Let's see. Okay, so this is what I think the problem is with persistence, is we're all Oliver. You know, we are going to these donors like Sloan Foundation and others trying to get money, begging for more, essentially. And we basically have a line of different PID providers coming up to the same donor saying, please, can I have some more? And just begging for that money that is needed to sustain or keep that PID service persistent over time. And we're really all busy providing the PID services and worrying quite a lot less about where that money is going to come from next and ensuring that continuity. But you know, it's really essential that we don't have to, you know, keep going to the same donor every year to get more money to keep the thing afloat. And so as a result of that, I think different PID providers are essentially pitted against each other in like this kangaroo style fight here, where we sort of have ORCID setting up membership fees and a structure, and DataCite setting up a membership fee structure, and Crossref having the same, but actually going to the same source for funding for that. So you're going to the university membership model to pay there, so the same donor and the same members are using these services at universities. And this is you know, quite a competitive environment. We're competing for with the same groups of people to give us money. So I think what we really need to do is just remember that PIDs are indispensable in the research process. So they're really indispensable in the discovery, you know, they're the underlying thing, the underpinning thing for FAIR. You know, they're essential for tracking research impact, for citing research, etc. And I mean, the point of having the dinosaur here is, you know, yes, you can go extinct if you don't let people know how indispensable this service is. And it really should be just an essential component, just a business as usual part of research workflows and research processes. And that's why I think reports like this one from Phil and the More Brains Co on the cost benefit analysis are really critical, because they demonstrate to everyone in black and white, this is the benefit of PIDs, this is the cost savings that the sector can make and reinvest in a range of different areas of research, you know, if we invest in PIDs. So I think we need to get better at marketing. I think we need to work together on that rather than compete, and really put some energy instead of into making the PID system really, really great. We need to do that, absolutely. We need to have the technical stuff and the engineering part totally sorted, but we also need this nice marketing wing. And I think we're not really great at that. No one's really good at that, and we need to get better at that. And the sort of bottom right thing, I quite like that graphic in that you know, each of the different PID providers can still be maintained separately, but we're actually working together in the same system to market, to have a coordinated approach to the sector as a whole, investing in the PIDs. Because I think the money is there, the money is definitely there. It's just you have to demonstrate the value to get it, and that's what we need to do, and that's what will ensure persistence from that point of view.
So, Natasha, one of the questions I guess I'll have for you, you're talking about different PID systems essentially competing with each other. Yes and no, right? Because you've got also different stakeholders that are, for example, using Crossref is more publishers than some of the other groups, and DataCite is more repositories, and ORCID is more university libraries, different places that they're hitting. Yes, it's all, a number of these are universities, but not quite. And so I guess the question I would have for you, right, is, does it make sense for a combined ask? I know it's something that we talked to you about back in the day when I was still at ORCID. Should DataCite and ORCID be working together, for example, on a joint business model or a joint payment? Is that a direction that you see would perhaps be fruitful for folks? And I know you guys are also just starting up ROAR, and Jens will talk about some of the work that one PID system, IGSN, has been doing to partner with DataCite, and the ROAR is partnering with DataCite as well. So, I mean, is that what you kind of foresee in the future, is more kind of collaborations between these PID systems on the sustainability side?
Well, from my point of view, the real power in PIDs is the connection between them. So the PID graph and the way they all interlinked, and the way that you can track the value, you could track the impact of something and the linkages between researchers and all those objects. I think that's the value. So regardless of whether Crossref is talking to publishers or DataCite is talking to, universities, it's actually, the power is in that interlinking, and therefore it makes sense to me that the greatest value is when you invest in a number of PIDs that enable you to track that impact and to come together. So even if Crossref is still separately targeting publishers, say, I'm just talking about a coordinated approach. I'm not saying one consortium, one PID federation, one thing. I'm just talking about a coordinated marketing approach, so that we're not kind of, and the value is in that connection. And that's really, I think, what we should be saying together.
Do you think there's any place that has done this well, or any group of PID providers or any PID user purchaser that has done this well, where there's been a joint kind of collaborative effort to support this PID ecosystem?
I don't think there's any hugely outstanding examples there. I'm not sure. I mean, I see a lot of ORCID and DataCite consortiums, say, growing side by side, and obviously, I mean, Phil might be able to talk about that more. The UK model is more merging towards a convergence of those, but as I said, I don't think it necessarily has to be. In Australia, it's more coordinated between ARDC and AAF, who run two different services. They run ORCID and we run the other services, but it's coordinated together between the organisations. Doesn't have to be one organisational structure to do that. Yeah, I'd like to have some examples. I don't know if anyone does have them. I can't think of any off the,
Jonathan, you're up next. I see your hand raised.
Yeah, there's a couple of ones which aren't quite on the same scale as you're saying, Natasha, but I think they're relevant. One of them is in Japan. So the Japanese Link Center is a registration agency for DOIs on its own and other identifiers. And it chose to be a member of the DOI Foundation, but it also is a member of Crossref. And so in a way they're peers, but they're also members of each other. And that kind of we do it on our way as well, being members of DONA and working with EPIC. So there's this kind of nesting where each one is a member of the other. And what that does is help the coordination between them. And it also gives much more a choice to the underlying sort of communities. What do we choose? What meets our needs? Do we need a Crossref flavor of DOI, or do we need, and okay, this is within the DOI world, but I think it applies beyond that. And the second observation I'd make is the services that are more important. So when you see that the same people are involved between ORCID, DataCite, and Crossref, what that's enabled is some really cool services to be developed. So the one I love the most is the auto populating of the ORCID record, saves researchers oceans of time. But it came about because the people talk to each other, meet each other. We're sort of, and it's incestuous in one way, so maybe dangerous, but on the other, it leads to some really cool things. So I do see some, the more we talk, it's why I support the PID Alliance approach as well. The more we're talking and exchanging information, the more chance I think we'll have of finding ways to interoperate, because it's a social infrastructure. I'll get off my soapbox now.
I have a question for Jonathan, though. The ORCID example is a good point where, from your perspective, it's obviously useful and solving somebody's problem. But just the other day, I heard from Martin Fenner that it actually doesn't solve the problem. That it was intended to solve the CV problem, where you have to again and again and again put together your publications list. But from his perspective, he says it actually didn't solve it. It's not how it's being used. It's now being used in a different way. So there's been a shift in value proposition. And that it's quite interesting. And what does that mean for the persistence of a system? Do you have to stick? How closely do you have to stick with your original value proposition? Sometimes that's good, sometimes not. That describes quite a delicate balance in keeping the community interested in the system. Things shift, and does the system shift with them, or does the system slowly drift away and the community loses interest?
Yeah, it's a good point. We have it also from the funding perspective. So the most recent application to join is from the construction industry, and it has almost, well, I don't think anything to do with scholarly infrastructure at all. So it's not relevant in that perspective, but it is highly relevant for the persistence of us as an organization, because financially it makes us more secure. So there's also that payoff, right? We have to pay attention to our persistence as a provider, and that may mean we provide services outside the initial area, which was in this case scholarly. It's a good point. Derek.
So I would like to add to the comment from Jens. It's and one additional question as well. So from my perspective, ORCID came from the commercial publishers. They really like to have these personalized searches within their databases, and that's why they were right at the beginning with ORCID and pushing forward to actually combine their local or company internal system of identifying authors to make it running across all publishers. So that's something they wanted to solve this problem, and maybe they just jumped on the train of ORCID and kind of they solved their problem, but as Jens and Martin mentioned, it didn't solve all the problems which have been hoped to be solved by ORCID. The second or the question I would like to ask to the community here is, if the network of the interlinkages of identifiers and the nodes of like repositories are the real value of the whole thing, the research graph, why is it still so hard that the funders, they push the scientists, you have to put your data into a repository, but some of the repositories are not sustainably funded. They have some kind of business model, but it's not really sustainable funded. And I ask the question I have is still, we have been building museums to keep collections back in the centuries, but we still have not made this point of there's digital data and we need to store them somewhere. We need to take this responsibility and start doing it and keep it for the long term. Same thing with the PID providers. There are some of them are nationally funded, like in Australia. I really like the model there, but some others are just not. They still rely on their business model and the funding, which the money comes from projects or universities funded by some national funding organization. It's still a kind of bubble, which is, I don't know, is a little bit intransparent. And I would like to hear some opinions on that from you.
Yeah, I think there are dependencies there, Dirk, and I think you've pointed out some of the sore spots, of which repositories is one. And I am a co-chair of the Data Policy Standardization Interest Group here, and we had an update from PLOS at our session. And there's still in most researchers are providing their data in the supplementary section of journals, and that's probably not a surprise for everybody. That's the data associated with the article, just to clarify, not the overall data set, but it's still in supplementary section, and the repository part is increasing. Use of repositories is increasing, but it's slow, and I think it's a challenging landscape. And yes, the PIDs definitely have a dependency there. I also think we're just as an aside, I don't think we're very good at selling the research graph idea. I don't think conceptually calling it a research graph is very helpful. I think we need to think up some better ways of explaining what it is and what it does.
Yep. The marketing piece, right? Yuri, you have had your hand up for a bit. We'll take one more question, then we're going to move on to the next speaker.
Yes, actually, one of the last face-to-face meeting on the PID, I was just at that time was my fresh research on how is data addressed in cloud provider infrastructure. Both examples, Amazon and Azure. So their concept of addressing data is actually data lake that allows semantic addressing any piece of data, including file system in which they are stored. So the question is, they use also identifiers. For how much is persistent is depend on actually customers who put data on this. But their system, you can imagine what cloud providers, what can they process, store, what size of data, is terabytes, petabytes. So this system is capable to do this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if we look for technical solution, we may look for how it is done by cloud providers.
Yeah.
I'm not extending question, what if a cloud providers provide us services for addressing data in general? Because we identifying and creating infrastructure for data identification. For us, this topic is interesting, not about publication, exactly about data that are produced, IoT, different systems, robotics, say, for example, flight data that need to be processed and put into provenance or lineage procedure. So PID infrastructure is really interesting and important. But if you look also at the example of the internet, analogy is a DNS and IP infrastructure. Interesting that it is supported actually by provider and association of providers of internet services. So if we have a sufficient number of data providers, thinking about IoT data, I think they create association of providers and will support this infrastructure. It's just provocative comment.
Does anybody want to comment on it? I'm going to add a little, I've been spending this week actually working with researchers on data types and trying to understand where folks need help to build data management plans. And there's a number of universities that are investing heavily in cloud computing, cloud services to store these large data files that generated through, for example, gene sequencing. It's really been interesting to hear how the PIs have been starting to move their raw data up into AWS. So I definitely think there's an opportunity there to figure out how to work with these cloud providers. I would like to see still kind of, the metadata, the kind of governance piece of this, and the persistent identifier so that this data can remain or actually be fair, right? And not just persistent, but also fair. So they're accessible, interoperable, et cetera. So, all right, any other comments before we move on? I've been requested to change up the order of the speaker list due to a conflict. So I'm going to go over to Larry, and Larry might actually have a comment for you, Yuri, based on what you just said. So Larry, it's over to you.
Okay, thanks, Lori. And thanks for moving it up. I have someone's driving 10 hours to come and see my wife and I, and they're about to show up, and I'd like to greet them. So I do have a comment on the previous thing, which is I'm not quite sure I got it all, but and it's along the lines of this. It's never been easier to put a service up on the internet. It's never been easier or cheaper to have system administration is disappearing into a commodity. We're DOI, so I'm responsible for the backend DOI resolution system. We're doing about 1 billion transactions a month. We're doing that level of activity with basically the same staff and the same budget we had 2 orders of magnitude ago. It's gotten that much easier. I don't even know how many servers we have up at the moment because the number go up and down corresponding to the traffic. Now, so the technology is there and it's growing dramatically. I expect this to be twice as good in a year, or 10 times as good in 5 years, something like that. The issue is organizing it all and responsibility for it all, and that leads into my prepared thoughts. No slides, just a few prepared thoughts. The first one, it hardly seems necessary with this crowd, but I'll go through it. It is organization that matters for persistence. Technology, the goal of technology here is to get out of the way and to make it easy as possible for organizations to do the right thing, for individuals to do the right thing. And maybe of some interest, I'll make a couple of analogies. The first is trust. So many years ago, I used to hang out at DARPA, and when the asymmetric encryption showed up, public-private key stuff, the word in the hallways was, well, we've solved the trust problem. Okay, good work, everyone. High fives all around. And what actually was done was there was another way to demonstrate trust. But that doesn't mean you could trust it. You can trust things just because there's a public key or a private key. It just gives you another tool. Blockchain is the newest version of that. Blockchain can be useful, but it doesn't solve anything by itself. You have to have people who manage it, understand it, and deal with it as a tool and deal with it efficiently as a tool. Persistence is the same way. The technology is there. It has to be robust. It has to be reliable. We have to work on it. But then what you need behind that is an organization that works on things. Then my second point, and it'll be pretty brief, if we could have the 5 persistency slide back up, if someone could put that up. I have a slight addendum to that. So as Maggie and Jonathan, at least, maybe some others know, there's been an effort recently in the FAIR Digital Object Forum. So we've taken the idea of FAIR, which I assume everyone knows, although it's important to know it as an operational thing, not as a slogan. And that group is trying to define how to manage data in a fair way, such that machines can more easily navigate this enormous body of data that's out there and growing. So when you look at this, you see that the identifier serves to bind the object. And the implication there, I don't know if Andrew meant it just like this, because this is actually kind of old now, but the implication there is the purpose of that resolution is to obtain the object, to get it somehow. And that's sort of the elementary thing that we think about when we think about persistent identifiers. Point me at the thing. But as has been discussed already in this call, there are services as well. And one of the things that the FDO group is focused on, to my delight, is the idea of operations. So we would like these entities that are identified, these objects, to be subject to operations. That is, I want to be able to obtain an entity on the network, a digital object, by invoking its name, which is the identifier, and then talking to it and seeing what it can do for me. And when we go into the idea of especially interdisciplinary science operations, we need this sort of thing. We can't just hand someone a bag of bits. The identifier hasn't done its job if that's all that happens. You have to give it. You have to hand me this virtual thing in a way that I can use it, in a way that I can understand it, in a way that's useful to me. This is a difference from journal articles. I can hand a human being a journal article. I can't, and the human being will understand it. I can't hand the machine a matrix and have it figure out what to do with it because it needs more. I need to know what I can do with that matrix, and the machine needs to know how to take the next step with that matrix. So I think our 5 persistency needs to at least make it clear that resolution is not just to obtain the object, but to use the object, to do something with it. That's the end of my prepared thoughts. If anybody would like to.
Before Larry leaves us, would anyone like to ask him a question? Otherwise, he's running and we will not have him anymore. Hands anyone? So I think you're spot on as usual, Larry. You know, it's not just about show me the landing page. It's how can I actually inquire, interact with this thing that the ID is pointing to, is binding. So I think that's kind of the next big frontier for a lot of this, right? Being able to have that, to Maggie's point, the metadata in there so you know what you're inquiring about and how to interact with it. And Maggie, you're up next. But also have that binding that allows you to get there. So before you go, Maggie has one question, then you get to go, Larry.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that there also there is an element of dynamics, or how to put it, in this as well, because you also need to be able to ensure that these linkages to operations and services and all those chains, that can be kept up to date. Someone needs to take responsibility for maintaining the information at all times and updating it if there are changes. And I think that's something that we forget about persistence, or many people forget about persistence, because for them it's like, okay, I've entered all this stuff into the PID registry or my catalog now, and I don't ever need to interact with this again. And that's not going to work either so well.
Right.
And that's also needs funding, by the way. So
Yeah,
that adds to what Natasha was saying before about the needs for funding and fighting about or formulating funding applications in a way so that it becomes glass clear to the funders what it is that we are asking for.
All right. Yeah, so like you have this whole big infrastructure and a PID graph, but it's more than just that graph, right? It's creating a three-dimensionality to this, and a temporal piece of it is I now find the data. Can I start interacting with that? That's yeah, we've got to get there, but we have to build the graph too. So it's almost like, can we do some early work on how do we get to interacting with this data to help, to Natasha's point, market the utility of this PID graph, and then further market the utility of using PIDs in the first place. So there's all, how do you leverage all these pieces to actually build this wonderful thing we're talking about? Right. Larry, thanks for your comments. Tell your visitor we said hello.
Okay, I'll hang around for another few minutes until he actually knocks on the door.
Okay, awesome. We've moved the schedule around. So Jens, I believe you are up next, and Phil, you're going to be running sweep at the end of this and bringing all of the comments together. So go for it, Jens.
Okay, having been involved in building two PID systems, the precursor to DataCite and IGSN, I'm very acutely aware that building a PID system is not primarily a technical problem. That's very much a socio-technical problem. And going back a couple of years, we suddenly saw a proliferation of PID systems where it became really easy to do that. And so people did. They came up with new ideas and built them. But what we've heard in the persistence discussion today is that you have to remember, when you build yourself a PID system, it's not just for Christmas, it's for life. You really have to care for it for a long time. But this is just the technical level, where I see the challenge and the value is getting the buy-in. You have to demonstrate the value of why maintaining the system is worthwhile. And one of the key things for that, for me, has been the power of identifying objects and people across institutional boundaries, because there have been institutional identifiers for a very long time, be it in the libraries, collections, museums, personal identification papers. There's lots of identifying systems around within institutions, but to have that work across institutions, that is on the one hand challenging, but also a real value, especially in research where people and things move around between organizations. So we have to break open those silos to demonstrate that value. But part of that is also that when we build these systems, we have to straddle this boundary between building something that is technically sound, but at the same time also able to adapt to changing needs. And especially when we come to the semantic side, I really thought Maggie's comment was excellent, that PIDs would be very useful in identifying semantic concepts. And this hasn't had much traction yet in that community. In that community, there's a lot of my way or the highway, and and that makes things very brittle and builds barriers to adoption, because then other people also have the attitude of, it's not my way, so I'm going to do something else. From the organizational perspective, we have to ask the question, how many infrastructures do we need? Can we just decouple the running the infrastructure from the application model that sits on top of it? We saw this in our experience with building IGSN in parallel to DOI, where we were building two almost identical systems with two different purposes, but technically they were more or less the same. And that turned out to be not sustainable for IGSN. So going back together, I think, will be the way forward for those two identifier systems to increase the value of the services they can offer, while maintaining one infrastructure, which for the subscribers means one subscription. They don't have to maintain 2 subscriptions. It's like in streaming services. If you can get more from one subscription, you would opt for that instead of having 5. So to come back to my initial point, it's not a technical question, and also the question, where do I store? Is it my local server? Is it the cloud? That doesn't matter. In CSIRO, we're pretty agnostic to that. It's about being able to identify what am I talking about and providing a service model that makes it easy to adopt.
Any comments?
Jens, at what point would you think is it still necessary to run on a subscription model instead of switching to something else? It's at what, how much value do you need to provide that you're becoming an infrastructure that is actually supporting without any hesitation the whole community? That if, as long as you depend on subscriptions, just consider DataCite, all subscribers just quit. What would happen to DataCite?
It would fold, but that's the thing, that why then maintain DataCite if nobody wants it?
Yeah, but if it's a very important part of the research graph, then having it fall is at some point it is too big to fail, I think. And
it's a bit, I disagree. I think that's a bit of a chicken and an egg question, which we also had in the format obsolescence discussion, where people said, well, if nobody uses it, then we don't need to maintain it. Just for the sake of, then it's a museum piece that you can store somewhere.
But the subscription model works on the term that you want to have new identifiers. For all the already existing identifiers, you need to maintain DataCite, even though if the subscription model breaks,
but
something needs to continue.
I get your point, but I'm making the counterpoint that if nobody cares, if nobody wants it, why keep it?
Okay, yeah, that's true. But let's Jonathan and Maggie, they have raised their hands. So I'm sorry for pushing in. It's
Jonathan, unmute yourself. I'm sure John.
Yeah, sorry, I was coughing. Yeah, I had it raised for something else, but you make a good point. I mean, we think about this all the time. What happens if it goes away? What do we do? And formally, if DataCite folds, then one of the other RAs gets to manage at least their legacy, if not the ongoing business. If they fail, it's a chain. If no one needs it, I think Jens is right. But at the moment, that doesn't seem to be the case. The other way to mitigate is what I put in the chat is not to rely on single business models and try and spread the risk. So DataCite also applies for funding for part of it as well to do some projects and try and diversify, because just like any organization, if you're too much dependent on a source of funding and that funding goes away, changes, someone changes their mind, new president comes in, whatever it is, you're hung and dry. But yeah, it's the hardest part. It's what I call business continuity. So the rest of it, I think we've come up with answers, but how can you guarantee that these organizations we call into being will persist beyond my lifetime for sure? It's all I think you can do is to try and do the what if scenarios. So what if it fails? Well, here's what we do, and have a backup to the backup to the backup.
Mhm.
But in the end, I don't know if there's a guarantee. I'm not sure. I'd love to come back in 100 years and see if it's all still here.
Maggie, over to you.
Yeah, I would just point out that it's not necessarily the same stakeholders that would be affected or that are interested in in data site services in terms of minting new DOIs, that would be the ones losing out if the service closed. Because remember that if we are now using these identifiers in, for instance, workflows, in scripts, in all of those things, then both reusability and reproducibility of research would be in a even worse crisis than it is already. So that is also an extra dimension, I think, that we should also not forget. And that's one of the things that we will also be discussing, or already has been discussing, have been discussing in a European context in the working groups and task forces around persistent identifiers that the European Open Science Cloud is organizing. And earlier we were trying to follow to construct the PID policy for the OSCE, and also look at what the PID service architecture repercussions or what's the word, consequences would be from that policy. And now we're moving more into looking at the real use cases and not just living in this sort of cloud of policies, etc. But I think this stakeholder dimension is becoming more and more important to consider.
Yep, I'm with you on that. So I'm not going to take my prerogative here as the chair. I'll do that later. But I'm going to turn this over to Phil because he's been waiting very patiently for his time. And then we can throw it open again and see what comes. So go for it, Phil.
All right, I'm just going to share my screen then. All right, you should be able to see a nice picture of a windy road, which I think is a good metaphor for the progress of persistent identifiers. So we've covered a lot of ground, haven't we, so far? So we've talked about some of the organizational, some of the technical components of persistence, and we've also talked a little bit about some of the financial sustainability components of persistence, and the fact that that persistence is not really just a function of technology. In fact, it's a function of organizations. And so that's why we have to look at so many aspects. One of the things that, well, the thing that I'm going to sort of focus in on is the fact that for something to be truly persistent, it has to be used. And in order for something to be used, there has to be incentives. There has to be reasons why people want to use it. And I'm going to suggest now that we have a little bit of a challenge with these incentives being misaligned. And I think it speaks to that conversation we were just having about if nobody's willing to pay for a particular piece of infrastructure, should it continue to exist? Well, I think that sometimes we have to take a broader view of that. So here's a vision. I won't say the vision because it's a vision of a PID optimized research lifecycle. And the idea is that information ought to be able to flow around the research cycle from, we've got researchers and institutions at the bottom there, through to funders when they apply for grants, and then they get grants, and then the information flows back, and then they publish outputs, and then that flows back to the institution and then the funder. And so you end up with this wonderful circle of information flowing nicely in a circle. And this results in tremendous gains in efficiencies and reduction in admin burden. But the challenge is that it requires significant integrations. It requires standards, it requires technical and social integrations between the various stakeholders in the system. And currently, I think we have a little bit of a challenge in the fact that a lot of information is lost and ends up having to be re-entered, rekeyed, entry performed manually, those sorts of challenges. Now, if you want a more closer look at this this research cycle, there is a DOI here at the top of this page, which is a poster that was that my colleagues at More Brains and I put together, which sort of goes into detail about all the different sort of information transactions that could, in principle, be performed and would save a lot of time and effort. So if I can be a little bit inflammatory and a little bit controversial, we feel that there has been certain assumptions that have gone into the building of persistent identifier systems and the organizations that support them. And I think some of the most important assumptions is that if you provide a way for people to enter information, or for organizations to enter information into the research management ecosystem, they will do so, because they would see an obvious need to be able to create their own profile and express their own outputs and interests and impacts and so on and so forth. The problem is that, and I think we've touched on this a little bit, is that PIDs have value as a network. So if the day that ORCID was launched, I registered for an ORCID ID, then my ORCID ID essentially would have no value whatsoever. But when everybody else has got an ORCID ID and it's integrated into my institution, it's integrated by the funder, it's possible to channel information directly from the publisher through the auto update that we've already discussed in this session, then it becomes incredibly valuable. And so PIDs exhibit these very, very powerful network effects. It's also true that a lot of the use cases require metadata from multiple stakeholders. So just on the left here are some use cases that I came up with while throwing together these slides. And I don't think it's worth me going into terribly much detail, because what this really draws on is the concepts of the PID graph. And we've already talked quite a bit about that. There's a great blog post here from Martin Fenner and Amir Ariana from 2020, which goes into the rationale of why it's important to interlink all of these different persistent identifiers through links in the metadata to other PIDs of various components, so that you can ask questions across the entire ecosystem. So I've made a couple of pretty big, strong claims here about loss of information and waste in the system and lack of buy-in and lack of incentives. What is my evidence for making such outlandish and inflammatory claims? Well, we've done a couple of studies at More Brains, mostly in collaboration with JISC. So most of this work has come out of the work that we've done with JISC. The first one was a survey of just less than 100, I think, individuals who work for organizations, mostly in the UK, mostly research institutions. And we asked them about persistent identifier adoptions and integrations. One of the big findings that came out of that was an unmet need for PID integrations in funder systems, and between funder systems and CRIS systems and institutional research management systems, because there is a challenge of that information not easily flowing between those different stakeholders, and people having to manually rekey data, whether that's information about an article that they've published or a data set, or linking an output to a particular research grant, or reporting back to that funding body of progress according to whatever the requirements of their grant or whatever mandates happen to be in place. We've taken that a step further, and the cost benefit analysis that we did for JISC, which is the cost benefit analysis for a centralized PID consortium that would cross 5 priority PIDs, which includes Crossref, it includes ORCID, it includes RAIDs and RAW, and we took a fairly conservative estimate, and we worked out how much money would be saved if, again, very conservatively, if for each article that was published, so just focusing on articles, that researcher had to rekey that metadata into just one system. And of course, that is quite a subset of what's actually going on, because it's just articles and it's just assuming there's only one system that things have to be rekeyed in. And we calculated the cost of that, the wasted effort, to be about £4.2 million a year in the UK alone. So the real amount of wasted money, the real amount of wasted time is going to be much, much larger than that. And that's not even getting into the opportunity costs of better decision making when you are able to answer these more interesting questions from a research management perspective on a strategic level by funders, by institutions, and so forth. Of course, we're not the first people to make this observation. If you look at some of the stuff that a lot of PID providers have worked on to try to encourage participation, there's the excellent work from Crossref around its outreach efforts, as well as the participation reports, which was a really interesting way to almost gamify completing the metadata fields for publishers, and it was incredibly successful. I've spoken to publishers who say, yeah, we were really interested in doing that, and we got kind of obsessed with making our participation reports as good as possible. So that's an effective way that has been used. And if you look at ORCID's strategic plan for 2022 to 25, you'll see something very similar to that research cycle that I showed you earlier on. And it's an acknowledgement that there is a need to take a holistic and community-driven view of how to drive participation. And I think it stands not quite in opposition, perhaps a little bit, to this view that an individual system, an individual product, or an individual service must be able to be popular enough with the people who use it to be able to support it directly. I think that this interconnectedness means that, and this misalignment of incentives means that it's not always the case that you can rely on traditional supply and demand rules to decide what should be supported and how things should be made sustainable. So the question I put to the community is, how do we better align our incentives to encourage greater adoption and the use of persistent identifiers? Because I think that certainly the research that we've done shows there really is a pressing need to do that. Thank you.
All right. Do you want to unshare your screen?
I will unshare my screen.
Even though it's a gorgeous picture. I've ridden my bike down a street like that once. All right. I'm going to use my moderator prerogative to say one comment before I call on Jens and then Dirk, who have their hands up, I promise. And so one of the things, just kind of looking at this historically from my perspective, having worked at ORCID, was that and I think this really also brings what Natasha's been talking about, is how can we communicate the value of these systems to the community, right? I think those of us who work in these get it. We all get this, right? But when you talk to a funder and they don't get it. They need some actual physical something they can hold in their hands. So they're like, oh, I get it. And so while saying taking this full on community approach is exactly right, it doesn't always work because certain aspects of these communities don't get it yet. And so I think it always comes back to me to, how do we communicate this? Can we communicate it? And at ORCID, what we always were doing was trying to do little experiments to showcase, hey, if this worked, like for example, the Crossroad data site auto update. It's not perfect, but it was like this aha moment for so many people that got other people on the bandwagon to understand the possibilities of doing this work. So I guess I throw this back, and I don't know, I want to have the other folks ask your question first, but like, how can we work together, right? And not just say you should all get it, but how can we provide those aha moments to people through those really succinct and amazing marketing opportunities, but also through some of these experiments to actually show how this would make a difference. So anyway, I'll leave that hanging out there. Jens, you're first. Maggie, you're next. And I thought somebody else had their hand up. So go ahead, Jens.
Thanks, Phil. The question about the alignment is an excellent question. And it reminded me of a similar question that was asked at the start of the open access movement, when the European Commission looked at the business model of academic publishing, which at the time was about the market share of the music industry in Europe. Mm-hmm. So it was a huge market that didn't receive much attention by the public, but huge value. And what they noticed was that there was a massive misalignment that they were considering stepping into, where you had a supply oligopoly on the side of the publishers and a demand oligopoly on the side of the libraries, negotiating about the price of subscriptions, but the actual consumers of the product weren't involved in the pricing.
Yeah.
So
they said, model.
Yeah, kind of. That's a very nice analogy, and that kind of was never followed up by the Commission. But they said, if you don't get this under control, we will need to step in because we see this as a market failure. And so, in getting uptake for PID systems, we again have to look at this question. And this is where I would ask questions about that first circular diagram where institutions and researchers are in the same box, but they aren't, because the researcher doesn't pay for the services. Usually it's the organization that pays. And having advocated for new PID systems in organizations myself, I'm very acutely aware of that difference, with this difference between the technical buyer and the economic buyer who holds the purse strings. And so the question of that alignment is a really good one. But then the benefit, the example you gave about keying in your publications information into just one system. When you look at the practices of CRIS systems, it's actually the other way around, that often I have to populate the CRIS system first to get the permission to publish or some clearance, and then it goes into the open, and then it comes back from ORCID, which from my perspective, I experience this every time, doesn't help me a bit. So those alignment questions are sometimes quite subtle.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. I mean, thinking about that cycle diagram, that is purely about the flow of information. It's not about the economic transactions. And in terms of the flow of information, then the researcher is often putting information into university systems. And so that's why those two are grouped together in that representation of it. But you're quite right that they have different motivations very often, not least because researchers are often treated like independent contractors within universities. So there is a relationship between the researcher and the institution, which is quite separable in the way, or more separable than it is perhaps between another type of organization and its employees. So they are sort of semi-autonomous, more autonomous than other types of workers at different sorts of organizations. In terms of that information flow, again, in terms of the CRIS system and it going out and it going back again, we did very much consider that as we were doing our analysis. And there are a number of institutions within the UK, and we were looking at the UK, where there are integrations between the CRIS system and the publications router that JISC has, but even accounting for that, there are a large number of institutions where those integrations don't exist, or they are incomplete, or they are not very good. And so as a result, researchers find themselves having to enter information into that CRIS system when they start a project, then enter information when they write the article, and then when the article comes back and it gets published, then they've got to put the DOI in, and then they've got to put more information, and then where's the repository version, and where's the version of record, and they're putting all that sort of information in very often in a very, very manual way. So I would agree with you, if those integrations were in place, then that wouldn't be a problem. But the point of some our strong findings is that those integrations very often aren't in place.
Thank you.
Maggie, over to you.
Yeah, I would just give one more example of a connection between different administrative systems that doesn't really work very well. So in Sweden, we are now talking a lot about data management plans like everywhere else, but and there's also some kind of push from high above that we should be moving on to these machine actionable DMPs, or at least part of the DMP content should be machine actionable. But that has broken down completely. So now it's basically each university doing their own thing vis-a-vis the different funding organizations, and information is also entered more or less completely manually. It's not connected to a CRIS system. It's certainly not working if there is a collaboration between researchers of different institutions or different universities, because they cannot share information between each other, or they could, but they aren't. So it's also making people less and less incentivized to actually put good effort into this data management plan. So we're back at this cut and paste system, and is not really working. And what's even worse is that the information that, for instance, data centers would need to be able to extract from this and also connect it then to the PI's ORCID or something like that, that isn't being shared either because of personal data issues. And no one wants to involve ORCID because that's an external organization hosted in the US, and no one wants to be able to sort of let that system look into the Swedish system. So where it could be so fantastic and really work, but
yes, we have to find a way to address that, don't we? We have to find a way to expose the value of having this information flow freely, and that's that's what the CBA was about. It was about trying to put that into place. And as Laurie, you said, it's very hard for people at the government level and the funder level to understand the true value of that, because from a funder perspective, from a traditional funder perspective, and I think things are changing, so I need to sort of parenthesize it with that. From a traditional funder perspective, as far as they're concerned, researchers write research grants, they send them research grants and applications, and then that funder reviews it and decides what's going to be most impactful, and then they give the money to the researcher, and the researcher goes off and does that. They're doing their good, right? And that's their traditional view of where their responsibility for all of this stuff sort of ends. And so getting them to understand that there is another aspect to that responsibility to maintain the metadata and the information about that award and how that award fits into that researcher and that institutions and that country's research strategy and projects is the bridge that we have to gap, the gap that we have to bridge. And in order to, it's late here, it's gone midnight, right? And in order to do that, I think we have to demonstrate those incentives. And I think that's the point of what I'm trying to get at, is those incentives are not obvious. And so we need to find a way to align them and to demonstrate them.
Yeah. Natasha, you've had your hand up for a bit. You might have last comments here. So
oh, really?
Go for it.
Oh, no pressure. I'm not going to summarize everything. I just want to say that in demonstrating those things, we need to use really plain English speak, like the conversation, for example, says right to the level of a 14-year-old, like that's what we should be doing. And so that post from Martin and Amir is terrific. And I've heard Amir's presentation a lot. But, there are big tracks of his presentation that I don't understand. And I know this environment, imagine being a funder coming in, like, how am I supposed to understand this? What do you mean a graph? I don't know what you mean by a graph, like we have to really change the language. So, people, when we build these things, it's not always the builders of things that are going to be the best at communicating them. And that's why you hire a marketing manager and someone who can actually, package it up and use all the tools we have, like, I mean, you're looking at using a lot more video content, for example, and short video content to express this stuff. That's really where people's attention at the moment is so short, even in research. And say it's that elevator pitch conversation. You're in a lift with the head of the DVCR of whatever, you've got 3 minutes, 2 minutes till the elevator bings to make your pitch, and that's the sort of stuff we should be thinking of, and from their perspective. So I think we should invest in that side to demonstrate the value.
Right. And one of the things I've also found working with funders, I think a number of them are really very interested in this, right? Is they're also waiting for the people they fund, the researchers, to ask them to do this work. And in a lot of the work that we do, we don't engage the researchers. We're engaging with the institutions of all these things, but not with the researchers themselves, who are both benefiting and providing the benefit by doing these things, right? And so I think I'm just going to put out a little bit of a call here, is that we have got to engage with the actual researchers so they can understand why this is important. And Dirk and I have had a conversation about this last week, actually. But also that it is useful to them. And if we don't do that work, I don't think we're ever going to be able to connect these incentives together. Anyway, Jonathan has his hand up. Natasha, I don't know if your hand is still up, but your hand is okay. Very good. Jonathan, you can close the session.
Yeah, I was just going to respond to what Natasha said. The clearest one I've heard recently was around this whole global south thing, and basically the feeling is if my stuff doesn't have a PID, it doesn't exist. So there's if you don't have an identifier on your piece of content, no one will find it in the digital world. And I think that kind of clear message is really powerful. I thought that was, I can't remember who told me that, but I thought, oof, that's clear. And it's the way people feel in certain parts of the world.
Yeah.
And I think it's true.
Yeah. So I want to give you all back maybe 1 minute of your day. I want to thank Jonathan for organizing just a stellar group of people. I want to thank all of you for just a really stimulating conversation. And echoing Larry Lanham's comment, just thinking about this conversation versus trying to do this when we first started up the PID interest group, that the evolution of this conversation, our understanding of the incentives, as you're talking about, Phil, and Maggie, about what those sticking parts are, right? We're talking about persistence, but if we have an identifier and we don't have a definition in the source file, is that really helpful or not helpful, right? So lots of, and Jens, I like, and I've been working with you on this, right? How do we think about sharing infrastructure so that we can build on top of it those services that we really need to show and demonstrate benefit of that infrastructure itself? So lots of really great conversation here. Thank you all. Looking forward to doing this again in the future. And, oh, sorry, Maggie, you got your hand up, so maybe you can close.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing. First of all, I really enjoyed both this session and the first version of it. And it really increased my understanding of a lot of things. And I'm amazed at how broad and fantastic this field is and how much great work is being done. But I also would like to stimulate further connections in the RDA context between these interest groups and several of the working groups that are going on now, because I find PIDs are popping up all over the place, but there's a lot of misunderstanding and misconceptions and maybe sometimes overly simplified views of what is actually a very complex field. So I think, for instance, in the data granularity group, also the data fabric group, which is now the Fair Digital Object Fabric, I think we should be organizing not only at the plenaries, but also in the normal daily work of the groups. I think we should have more touching points.
Yep, that has come up. And if anyone else has other suggestions for how this interest group can better support, interact with some of these existing working groups or new ones coming up, please send those ideas to me, Jonathan, and Adrian, and we'll work on it. So there's so many things going on RDA, sometimes we miss it. Just can't keep track of it all. So yeah, send that up to us and we'll figure out how we can continue to form those connections. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Thanks everyone again for a really, really excellent conversation. Good night, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and we'll see you next time around. Bye.
Right. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for being so
you.
understanding.